Okay, let's talk about solitaire, hex and counter wargames. Particularly, let's talk about D-Day at Omaha Beach. Solitaire wargaming comes in various flavours. Some conventional wargames have solo modes. You also get solo miniature wargames. And some hex and counter wargamers play all of their games on their own, just playing both sides. Two-handed play. D-Day at Omaha Beach is a solitaire-only hex and counter wargame depicting the first 12 hours of the landings at Omaha on the 6th of June 1944, designed from the ground up for solo play. The game has 4 scenarios. Easy Fox covers just the initial landings on the east end of the beach by the US 1st Division. It uses only a small part of the map and acts as an introduction to the game. I will talk about it in a moment, and I would advise playing it first. The First Waves covers both beaches, but only the first few hours, and online is the scenario you see talked about most often. Beyond the beach is a historical scenario, giving the position of US forces as it was when the first waves finished, and covering the rest of the day. I would see this one, much like Easy Fox, as a training scenario. The important thing to understand is that incrementally the game adds new rules bit by bit as turns advance, and the result is that the game in the latter half is a very different game to the game in the first half. If you play the full game scenario, then obviously that is changing across the whole game that you play, but it's useful to have the training scenario Beyond the Beach to kind of get familiar with the full rules before you actually try to play a game covering the entire 12 hours. Just so you know, in this first part today, because this is going to be a 2-part tactical review, I am only going to be looking at Easy Fox and the First Waves. Starting with Easy Fox because it illustrates the basic principles of the game. In Easy Fox, you operate only the eastern half of the beach, the section reserved for the First Division and facing draws E1 and E3. The draws being the low valleys which allowed road access to the beach and which were the US forces' main objectives. The scenario covers only the first 16 turns of the game, and you need 9 points to win. And rather counterintuitively, I think it's best to begin with the victory points. In the full game, victory points are checked twice, once on turn 16 and once on turn 32, with different rules for each, and it's kind of important to understand how they work. On turn 16, you get points for holding German positions. The fortified nests defending the beaches are worth 1 or 2, depending on how many hexes they occupy. Positions further inland are worth 1 each. As you will notice, you cannot win by simply taking out the beach defences and occupying the positions. That only comes to 7 points, and in Easy Fox you need 9. And in any case, you don't have the forces to take all the German fortified positions in the first few hours of the landing. However, you also get 5 points for occupying a draw. To occupy a draw, you have to get units south of its defence and take out all the German nests that can fire on that position. What you should notice is that this usually means capturing one draw is a victory and failing to capture either of them is a defeat. This, for example, is a loss in the Easy Fox scenario. The First Division have not taken catastrophic losses, which is one of the ways the scenario can automatically end. That would require them to have lost 8 of their standard infantry units. The Americans control 4 victory points of enemy positions, but they do not control the draw, which would be worth 5. To explain, they do have a US unit that exerts a zone of control adjacent, infantry with 2 or more steps control adjacent hexes. But hex 0910 is a little bit peculiar. It is the only draw hex which comes under fire from German positions other than the fortified nests that begin the game occupied. And one of those positions, A1, was occupied by a reinforcement during the game, which the US forces have not managed to shift. It doesn't matter that I managed to take the other position, A2, or that the German unit in A1 is disrupted, or that it's been reduced and it would almost certainly fall next turn. It's still there on turn 16, so on turn 16 I do not control the draw, and I do not have enough points to win. This, by contrast, is a winning position in the Easy Fox scenario. The US forces still haven't captured enough positions to win the scenario, but they have taken draw E3. They've not been particularly lucky. Only one hero turned up. We'll talk about those in a moment. And that had quite minimal effect. And this has been a pretty bruising outcome. They've lost almost all their heavy equipment on the beaches. 5 companies have taken heavy losses. Remember, 8 would be a defeat. It feels almost like that apocryphal story about real military commanders being horrified at wargamers' willingness to take unprecedented casualties as long as they achieve the victory conditions. So let's expand this principle to the first waves scenario. In the first waves, the whole board is in play, but the victory points are calculated in the same way as they are in Easy Fox. In the first waves, you need to score 19 victory points to win and not take catastrophic losses. That's the 8 infantry companies with either division. In the full game, this point acts as a gate check, with you needing to score at least 11 points to continue playing and winning outright if you score 25 or more, because realistically, if you score 25 or more, the second half of the scenario is going to be a bit of a cakewalk. We already know what that means for the eastern end of the beach because we just looked at the problem of draw E3 being overlooked by reinforcement positions. Draw the wrong reinforcement card and you will fail to take it, so your efforts need to be directed at E1. And in practice, that usually means taking nest 62 to allow you to access the higher ground and then attacking the positions on the draw from the high ground. Key point I want to get across in discussing this is how ruthless you need to be. Take this actual position. You will see a small group of US units have landed on the far end of the beach beneath the cliffs. These units must be abandoned. In D-Day at Omaha Beach, you have a limited action economy, which is extremely limited in the initial turns. Some units can take limited free actions. Infantry, for example, can move up the beach until they reach the positions just in front of the shingles or bluff. Some units self-activate, rangers on the western edge, so not here, and heroes if you are fortunate enough to get an event card that allocates one to a unit. And of course, command units can give orders to nearby units, but only once they arrive. To begin with, you are stuck with 2 free actions you can allocate to units of your choice each turn for each division. What you cannot afford to do is spend those actions or spare a command unit or assign a hero to those 2 isolated units at the end of the beach because they are not part of your main effort. They are not doing the job that is going to score you the victory points. And if you do, that kind of splitting your focus will lose you the scenario. And I suspect make the full game much harder if you just about scrape through. Which brings us to the western end of the beach. Right hand, yes, I find the fact that the right hand end of the board is the western end very confusing and it's taken me a lot of getting used to. Should you take your main thrust against the 9 points around draw D3, or the 10 points around the D1 draw. Unlike the eastern end, I think this is a more complicated decision. Both draws can be taken by the forces you have available. In both cases, all you need to do is take out the nests that begin occupied at the start of the game. That's sufficient. As you can see here, where I've laid out US forces in their approximate landing positions, you can see that they don't really skew towards one or the other of the draws. That doesn't really force your hand, though a particularly unusual distribution when you check for how much US units drift might. Aiming at D3 means the 29th Division can coordinate with the 1st Division, because obviously they're near the border between the two. On the other hand, an attack on D1 is more easily supported by the Rangers, who tend to land at that end of the beach and, as we just discussed, get free actions. I suspect there's a whole bunch of factors here, and I think strategically working out which one you would aim for and under what circumstances you might shift between them is one of the big strategic decisions you are going to have to make for the first wave scenario or for the full game when you're playing that. Okay, so having gone through the strategic thing and reinforced the main takeaway from that, which is you need to be absolutely ruthless. You pick a draw on the eastern end of the beach, that's always going to be E1, and then you pick a draw at the western end of the beach and you throw everything at those two draws and you ignore the other one. Let's talk about the Germans attempting to stop you, and particularly about fire zones. Hexes are marked with 3 types of color-coded symbol representing intense, steady, and sporadic fire from enemy positions. Colors relate to nearby German positions and essentially tell you which hexes those German positions overlook and how intense fire coming from that position will be. In combination with a card draw, they tell you if one of your units is affected. Let's just walk through that with these 5 hexes as examples. Fire check is made for each sector each turn. Let's say we draw this card for the fire check. We check the line of boxes and symbols at the bottom. The presence of a color indicates that position will fire. The symbol in the hex is used to then check if units are hit. So in this case, any unit in a hex with a solid purple, green, or brown indicator will take a step loss. Then, any unarmored unit with a hex with a cross purple, green, or brown indicator will take a step loss if they have the circle symbol on the unit. And finally, for any hex with the sporadic hollow circle in purple, green, or brown, a unit with a circle symbol will be disrupted. You will notice that in this case, units in the very last hex, which has a yellow and red sporadic fire mark, are perfectly safe. Those color positions do not fire with this card. It's worth saying that German positions need to be occupied to fire. They can be suppressed. We'll discuss that in a moment. And that fire is capped. At this stage, they cannot hit more US units than there are German counters. And US units cannot, in the first half of the game, take more than 1 step loss in a turn. There's some other fiddly elements as well about whether or not the position will snipe at HQs and generals, and you can see that sometimes there's 1 box and sometimes there's 2 box. 2 boxes is more limiting. It means that only well dug in German positions with a depth marker will actually fire. Let's talk about the probabilities. All of this is driven by cards. It's definitely countable in the sense that you can look at the discard file and see how that is affecting the odds, but it's unlikely you're going to want to be doing this at this stage. Fundamentally, the card draw is not that different to a dice roll, and we can calculate rough odds. An intense fire dot has close to a 50% chance of inflicting a step loss. A steady fire dot has about a 1 in 6. Based on that, for these 5 sample hexes, you can calculate an approximate chance of a step loss, which I've done here. Hopefully you can see that the chances of casualties drop off fast as the number of intense and steady fire dots reduces in the hex. This heat map of the beach gives you a sense of the dangers units face. Red hexes are those with 2 or more intense fire symbols. Orange are those with 1 intense fire symbol, and yellow involve 2 or more steady fire but no intense fire. Green spaces are those which lack any steady or intense fire, spaces in which a unit cannot take a loss, it can only be disrupted, which is a temporary effect on the unit. Remember, in order to catastrophically lose, you would have to lose 8 companies from one of the divisions. That's a total of 16 step losses. If every unit passes through a red intense fire zone and then sits in a yellow danger zone, that's probably going to happen. You can see from this heat map that there are weaknesses in the German position. Essentially, between the concentration of defences around each draw, fire was less intense. On D-Day itself, historically, that was exploited organically, with troops in intense fire zones getting pinned down, while troops in less intense fire zones tended to move towards where they were being shot at less and infiltrate through. In the game, you need to exploit that deliberately. Essentially by pushing through in the positions I've marked. Tanks, and initially only tanks, much later in the game it will be possible to do with this with artillery, can barrage German positions. Barraging can suppress the German position, but the key trade-off is that it costs an action from your initially very limited supply of actions. It is resolved by drawing a card and contrasting it with the strength of the barraging unit and whether the German position has a depth marker. German positions, when occupied, will have a unit counter which is either hidden or revealed and may have a depth marker, the latter indicating the defenders are entrenched or much better prepared. So let's compare 2 shots and a card. The tank unit has 4 positions it can barrage, but we are just going to focus on the green position with a depth marker and the blue one without. To hit the first, the player would need to draw a card with both the position's colour and the symbol of the barraging tank, a roughly 1 in 6 chance. To hit the other, it would just need to draw the blue colour, roughly 1 in 2. If the player drew this card, they would be successful in hitting the green position because they have both the tank symbol and the green position's colour, but not the blue position because they don't have the blue colour. If the tank were strength 4 and had not taken a step loss, it would succeed in hitting the blue position because the blue position doesn't have a depth marker, and then the tank would only need its own symbol. This sounds a little bit complicated because essentially we're not rolling for target numbers. We're referencing these tables that essentially contrast a series of circumstantial factors. But it's actually not that difficult to get familiar with them. It just takes a little bit of practice and also kind of deliberate thinking about it while you're doing it. Let's go back to our heat map. When a position is successfully barraged, it becomes disrupted. The important thing that happens is that next time its colour is drawn in a fire check, it does not fire. Instead, it simply undisrupts. When a beach nest like the green WN62 is a double hex, you need to successfully bombard and disrupt both hexes to achieve this. But let us assume you've done that to WN62. This is what the heat map would now look like. And yes, it opens quite the gap, meaning in this case, if you can keep the green position disrupted with barrages, you are likely to save about half a step on every unit that passes through the middle section of the beach. Which leads into a dilemma in the early game. You have 2 actions per division per turn. Should you be spending those actions on your tanks to barrage and thus suppress German positions, or should you be spending them to move the tanks up the beach before the tide comes in and swamps your heavy equipment? In the early part of the game, you're landing on the first hex, the tide comes in at turn 7, and then you're landing on the second hex, and then the tide comes in again towards the end of the scenario, and you're landing on the third hex. When that happens, units that are too far down the beach are lost, which, because you don't get free actions to move the heavy equipment, often means heavy equipment. I'm not going to tell you what the right answer to that is. I will say I don't think there's any serious risk of a catastrophic loss if you use the tanks consistently to barrage. But you do rather want the tanks to get up the beach because they're really useful later on. Okay, let's talk about combat. US combat, which of course is different to German fire. For the first 3 to 4 turns of the game, a lot of what you're going to be doing is procedural. Other than barraging, you're not going to be doing any combat because you've not yet got to German positions. You'll be drawing cards to determine where units land, move infantry up the beach for free actions, draw cards to see which units get chewed up by German fire, and decide whether or not to spend your few actions moving heavy equipment up or barraging German positions. But by turn 4, you will likely have infantry adjacent to some of the nests guarding the beach, and combat will become an option. We'll start with this position, which must be turn 8 or later, because we can see the HQ is there. On the right-hand side of counters, there's a black number that indicates the turn on which a unit arrives for landing. The tank unit can be activated by the HQ, and H company has a hero, so gets a free activation. You would need to spend an action from your 2 actions per division to activate A company. There are several possible combinations you can make to attack these positions. Both infantry could attack the northern position, the one closest to the beach. They could each independently attack the northern and the southern position. H is up on the bluff, so it can attack the position that's up there. And the tank could support either attack. The tank is not adjacent, so it can't attack alone, but because it's coordinated by an HQ, it can add its strength and certain weapons values to an attack by an adjacent unit. For illustration, I'm going to divide this into 2 separate attacks. A solo attack by A company against the northern part of the nest, and an attack by H company supported by the tanks on the southern part of the nest. We'll begin by considering the attack by A company. What you are looking for an attack to succeed is for the attacking units to have greater strength than the German defenders, and for them to have all of the weapons required to do the job. And you begin the attack by revealing the unit that is defending the position. Here I've laid out the German units, or I think all of them. One of the slight frustrations with this game is it doesn't come with one of those nice one-page order of battles which shows all the counters laid out. I really like that in my Hex and Counter war games, and I miss it here. And it's also kind of awkward because it's really easy to lose a counter, and while it doesn't fundamentally harm things too much if you lose a German counter, it really is quite disruptive if you lose a US counter. So we are looking at the units without heavy weapons at the bottom, because we know that the position closer to the beach does not have a heavy weapon. It's not a 75mm unit. The first thing we check is, does the US unit have more strength than the German unit? And obviously, a 6-point US infantry is going to have more strength than a 1 or 2 point German unit. No, that would be true even if we were attacking across the shingles, which double the defender's strength. You also need to check if the attacking units have the weapons they need to take the positions, marked in the bottom left of the German unit. In this case, possibly Bangalore torpedoes, bazookas, Browning automatic rifles, or mortars. A full-strength US infantry is deemed to carry all of those. If it takes casualties, that changes. So this unit is succeeding, which means you then reveal the depth marker. Here are the depth markers. The depth marker's strength is added to the German units, as are the requirements in the bottom left. The strongest a combined MG position and WN depth marker can be is 5, so we are meeting the strength requirement. The best result you could get is to flip the depth marker and get a tactical reinforcement result. The tactical reinforcement is a gift whenever you draw it. You then add a German reinforcement. This would go in the purple position just off the edge of our view. But importantly, it then means it counts like the position you're attacking never had a depth marker, which means you're going to take it in this case. Less spectacular, but still good, are the top group that require demolition charges or radio. The US unit is deemed to have both of those. So again, it would meet the requirements. Now, it wouldn't take the position in the sense of destroy the unit. By the way, you don't move in immediately afterwards. You have to do that on a subsequent turn. But it would eliminate the depth marker. The most unfortunate would be the bottom group. The first 6 require artillery to take the position, which infantry don't have, but some supporting units like tanks or AT guns do provide if they're assisting. And the worst would be the bottom 2, which require naval artillery support. You can only get that as a result of an event card, so most games you're just not going to have it available. And generally speaking, you wouldn't waste naval support fire trying to take one of those counters out anyway. If attacking units do not have the required equipment, but they are facing revealed units and depth markers, and they double the strength of those, then they can apply an optional attrition. This means you take a step loss with your attacking units, and in return, the depth marker is eliminated. Only the depth marker. But importantly, that means next turn, you will then be facing a unit without a depth marker, and you'll have got rid of something like naval artillery or artillery fire or radio or whatever that you don't actually have available. That would have been an option for the US unit here if it had needed it. And yes, this does mean even though there aren't dice and the game doesn't use a CRT, it is possible to calculate odds for an attack. Yes, it's possible to count revealed counters to see how those odds have adjusted. In this case, you have a roughly 25% chance of eliminating the position, a roughly 30% chance of eliminating the depth marker, and a roughly 25% chance of being able to take a step loss on your unit in return for eliminating the depth marker, with only quite a small, about less than 1 in 5 chance that you will fail in the attack. And even if you fail, you'll know what the position is, which means you'll be able to organize a better coordinated attack next turn. I'm sure we could do a whole tactical video calculating odds for the most common types of attacks and therefore whether they are worth spending your precious actions on. Remember, it would take an action to do this attack with a company, though with those odds, it's absolutely definitely worth spending their action. And there's no question that's one of the tactical elements in this game that's really important to get a handle on when you're first playing. Complicated by the fact that subsequent inland positions use a different set of units and depth markers. So in the second half of the tactical review, we'll have to talk about those differently. For now, I'm going to settle by working through the analysis for the second position. The higher position on the slope is a 75, which means it's an artillery unit and it contributes to artillery attacks on the beaches an additional source of casualties for landing US units. It also means it will be one of the 6 slightly tougher units at the top. Several differences here. They're higher strength, they all require 2 weapons, and 2 of them require machine guns. Our infantry unit that is doing the attack has a machine gun because it's heavy infantry that's taken a step loss, but most infantry units do not. Fortunately, tanks supporting an attack within 3 hexes do provide a machine gun. I mentioned that the H company is reduced. You'll notice that there are 3 weapons listed there. So instead of the normal full complement, when a unit takes a step loss, it only gets a selection of the weapons available. Some of them have been lost or abandoned as the infantry have made their way up the beach. However, we do have a hero. In addition to allowing the unit it is attached to act independently, the hero marker can also be used in combat either to add 1 point of strength or to act as a wild card counting as any one weapon type. There is an exception to that, but it does not apply to any of the beach nests. As is probably apparent by now, this makes heroes incredibly powerful pieces, and since their appearance is a result of random event cards, the biggest luck factor in the first waves is how many and how early they appear, and probably one of the most important decisions you make is which unit to allocate the heroes to. Obviously, because of the combination of hero and tank support, the attack will have the weapons and strength to reveal the depth marker. The tanks will meet the requirement for artillery, which is common on depth markers. However, neither of the units has a radio, which is a common depth requirement. But fortunately, one of them is adjacent to an HQ, which provides that. So given the maximum combined defense strength is 6 versus the total US strength of 8, it is very likely the attack is going to succeed. The only way it could fail is if the German unit required a Bangalore torpedo and the depth marker required naval artillery, because the hero could only act as a wild card to fulfill one of the 2 requirements. If the total strength is also 5 or greater, which requires the specific combination of these 2 counters, the US would not have double the strength of the defender, and you would not be able to make an optional attrition, giving a remote chance the German forces might successfully resist the attack. Takes a little getting used to, and there are occasional ambiguities in the rules, but the combat system is very effective at creating interesting solo play. And as I suggested earlier, this is where much of the rote learning and tactical play of the game will, I think, initially be. You'd have to play a lot of games before you'd really mastered this. If you've not heard me talk about this before, I think of the learning curve of a game as consisting of a composite of 4 elements: internalizing the rules, familiarizing yourself with tactical plays, learning rote elements, particularly openings and endgames, and broader strategy. And though you tend to improve all 4 together, that order reflects both the order in which you will develop them and also the order in which they will have an impact on the game. Initially, just internalizing the rules will be far more help in most cases than learning opening or endgame strategy. The degree to which each of these is important, it varies from game to game. D-Day at Omaha Beach is a hex and counter war game, so expect internalizing the rules to take a long time. Other than a little bit of overall strategy around the victory conditions, getting your head round tactics is going to be the main focus. Rote learning, I suspect, is going to be modest, given the semi-randomized setups that are inherent in the US landings and the German reinforcement positions. While rote learning is not terribly important, to illustrate that it is not completely absent, I will give one example. From turn 7, you can choose to voluntarily delay units that are landing on the beaches. Artillery units are basically useless in Easy Fox and First Waves. This is because the rules governing their usage are very restrictive, and while you can meet the requirements before turn 16, it is very hard to do so and of limited value. However, they are extremely valuable after turn 16 both for their combat effect and also for their victory points. Frankly, I just delay all my artillery to that turn. And broadly speaking, I delay most of my guns and heavy weapons unless I've got somewhere they are specifically useful, which of course also means a place where either there's an HQ or I'm willing to spend commands to bring them into action. One final thing for this episode. I feel I should explain a few house rules I have adopted when playing this and that I would broadly recommend. When resolving German fire cards, I resolve each colour from left to right on the card. Because there is a cap on how many steps an individual US unit can lose, there is a rule which suggests you resolve in the order which optimises for the Germans. I object very strongly on a philosophical level to rules like this in solitaire games because I don't play two-handed, and so I don't think I should need to do the analysis for the bot. It should just operate according to a set of procedural rules. So I ignore this and just work left to right. It has very little impact on the game. The second one is also about reducing my mental overhead, and it relates to mines. At mid or high tide, a unit can be hit by a mine if a card with the correct symbol is drawn on a landing check. It's about 1 in 6. Historically, engineers were landed in quite large numbers with the first wave so that they could disarm the mines before the tide got close enough in to float them. But the rules for doing this are clunky, absorb a lot of time, add to the clutter of counters, and are almost entirely procedural with very little player agency. So I just don't use them. Instead, I ignore the engineering phase for the first half of the game, and if I draw a card with a mine symbol, I just inflict a step loss on one of my units. It makes virtually no difference, and it's eliminating a huge amount of procedural overhead for you as a player. My third house rule also relates to a piece of inelegant design. Infantry units have 3 steps, meaning they can take 2 hits before being lost. This is important to represent the gradual fracturing of discipline and loss of equipment. It also means when the second hit is taken, the unit's counter is removed and replaced with a new one. The one that's removed goes to the division loss box to track catastrophic casualties. The game contains 2 strength cadres that have only 1 weapon. Fine. The problem is the way it's implemented, which is just appallingly inelegant and clunky. For every infantry company in the game, there is a specific 2 strength cadre with a corresponding designation. This is pointless and tedious to sort, so I just don't bother. At the start of each game, I randomly select half a dozen or so of the cadres, put them face down to one side, and just draw one at random when I need one. Okay, worth covering this briefly in case you haven't played solitaire board games before. I think we need to say something about difficulty. I first encountered this when Thunderbird's cooperative game was released. Co-ops are structurally very similar to solitaire games. Almost immediately, players complained on internet forums that it was impossible to win, and when they discovered that other players weren't having the same difficulty, they became very aggressive. They made lots of very unpleasant accusation that other players who told them they could win were cheating. And I get what was going on psychologically. They had played a lot of games where it was very easy for them to hide the fact that they weren't very good at playing. Games that contain luck, games that contain catch-up mechanisms, especially Euro family games, and they likely overestimated the skill of their regular opponents. When you play a solitaire game or a cooperative game, you don't have anywhere to hide. And you do see this online. It's very easy to find people essentially saying it's almost impossible to win Easy Fox or First Waves. It's not even remotely close to impossible. It's actually fairly easy. I've probably given you the few bits of strategic information you need to get well over 50% win rates. Certainly, I'd done all sorts of experimental things with trying weird stuff out, and I was well over 50% when I scripted this, and I'm not a strong player. But be prepared psychologically. If you are struggling, you need to change up how you are playing considerably, which is often quite hard without a real opponent to bounce off. And you need to accept that it might indicate that a lot of your basic gameplay skills just aren't that strong. I think in the second part, I will talk about how you can adjust the difficulty. But I think it's worth saying that while the game itself doesn't contain anything that would allow you to adjust the difficulty, it is relatively easy to do so in the first waves. Event cards are drawn every turn after the first turn. This changes in the later part of the game, which of course we're not covering because we're only looking at the scenarios for the first half. Of the positive and negative cards, the single most important one you draw are heroes. But the point is that there are positive and negative cards. All you have to do if you want to adjust the difficulty is deliberately set aside and draw a certain number of extra heroes, or if you want to make it harder, cap the number of heroes you are drawing. Probably worth spending an episode on this, but the point is, heroes do decisively alter the difficulty. It is absolutely, unquestionably still possible to win the initial scenario without drawing any heroes, but it's significantly harder than it would be if you drew 3 or 4. Anyway, end of part 1. I don't usually split a tactical review into 2 parts. They're supposed to be a bit more self-contained that, but as I've kind of suggested, one of the unusual elements to this game is that the game sort of changes in the second half, with quite dramatic changes to the rules from turn 17 onwards, and therefore I think probably justifies having that in a separate episode. Plus, this would also be quite long, and I think, there's an upper limit to how long these episodes should be. For now, my summary of the first waves would be that you have an interesting solitaire game of relatively high complexity by solitaire standards, medium to medium heavy by wargame standards, whose focus is going to be primarily on tactical decisions. It has some replay value, as there is a random setup element, both in the hidden German positions and the drifting from landing checks, which can change the initial approach of US units. I suspect there's a limit to that replay value. You're going to get to a point after a certain amount of time where, barring catastrophic luck against you, you're going to be able to consistently win the first wave scenario. Once you've done that, there isn't really going to be a lot of interest in continuing playing. However, as I said, this is just part 1, and the first waves in principle just acts as a sort of advanced setup to the fighting in the second half of the day. So for now, thank you for listening, and here endeth the lesson.